Hi there, let's deal with our next topic, which is looking at the interesting topic of fossils. This is a very famous fossil. It's called an ammonite. And so, what are fossils? Well, fossils basically an impression or a cast. Could be original material, it could be a track or a preserved rock after the original organic organism has been transformed or removed. So in most cases, you do not have the original material, you simply have a copy of the original organism. So very rare, but what could a fossil be? Again, it could be original skeleton, but not the whole material or shell. Could be a mold or a cast, which we'll look at. Could be material that has replaced the once living thing, which is the most common, or traces such as footprints, etc. Most books, including ours, talk about 5 different types of fossils. A petrified, which is a rock-like remains. Trace fossils, which are usually evidence that the organism was there, like footprints or imprints or droppings. Original remains, which could be mineralized or preserved remains of the body parts, such as teeth, shell, bones. Now, if you have ever seen the movie Jurassic Park, you'll remember that they were lucky enough to have the original remains of a mosquito stuck in amber, which is tree sap. That is extremely rare. And probably the most common type is a mold, which is a negative imprint of the organism. And then a little less common is a cast, which is a positive imprint. Here's the 5 types again. So petrified, molds and casts, carbon or carbonaceous films, which is, these are leaves, that's sort of the organic material that is left behind, trace fossils, and preserved or sometimes called original remains. Petrified fossils, like this dinosaur, the word petrified means turns into stone. Petrified fossils form when minerals replace all the parts. That's all the parts of an organism. Water is full of dissolved minerals, so it'll seep through the layers of sediment and reach the dead organism. When the water evaporates, the hardened minerals are left behind. Let's talk about molds and casts. A mold is an imprint if an extinct mollusk, for example an ammonite, was to fall into the mud and it left behind an imprint of it. So molds form when the hard parts of an organism are buried in silt, sand, or clay. The hard parts completely will dissolve over time, leaving behind just a hollow area. A cast, on the other hand, forms as a result of a mold. So here's our mold. Let's say sediment comes in now and fills into the hard part to create a copy of what was there. So water and sediment fills the empty mold, and the mineral and sediment that are left behind is a cast. A cast is the opposite of its mold. What are carbonaceous films? So these are living things that contain an element called carbon. When an organism dies and it's buried in sediment, the materials that make up the organism break down. Eventually only the carbon remains. The thin layer of carbon left behind shows the delicate parts like leaves. Trace fossils, shows the activity of organisms. So an animal makes a footprint when it steps in the sand, or over time the footprint is buried in sediment and it becomes solid rock. Preserved remains, some organisms get preserved close to their original state. So amber, which we talked about, tar, an organism such as this woolly mammoth could get trapped in a tar pit and the tar soaks into the bones, preventing them from decay. Or ice. So what conditions do we need to promote fossilization? Well, we need hard body parts such as a skeleton or bones. And we need rapid burial and not much oxygen, because oxygen decomposes things quickly. And we also, in most cases, water needs to be around or available. So if the organism, when it dies, doesn't have water around to help, then the chances of it preserving are pretty slim. So we talked about these before, trace fossils, etc. Here are some body fossils. Here are some trace fossils. So these are droppings. So what are some modes of fossil preservation? We won't worry about that. One of the mummification, where you quickly dry, or refrigeration, where you quickly freeze. We can get altered forms, mold and cast, we talked about. Tracks. So here's the process that one might follow. So an animal dies and its skeleton settles on the seafloor and is buried eventually by sediment, because the sediment will build up over top, kind of like how sedimentary rock forms. Rivers carry the sediment to the sea and it starts to build up. The sediment surrounding the skeleton thickens and begins to turn to stone. The skeleton dissolves eventually, so even the hard parts dissolve, and ta-da, we have a mold. So this would be called a mold. Then, if you're lucky, water can seep into here once the mold is hardened and fill in the imprint and crystallize minerals, which would then give us a cast. So that's a mold and a cast. Again, here's a good example of it. Water has to be around and available. Sediment, animals buried by sediment, such as a volcanic eruption or silt, and it shortly dies. Its bones are protected. The layers build up. So here's the bones. The soft parts of the animal almost quickly get decayed. And eventually, movement due to tectonic plates could cause the organism to reach higher levels of the surface, and erosion can help expose the skeleton. Here it is again. So our little dinosaur is eating close to water, and something happens and it dies. Eventually, rock layers build up over top, and then erosion exposes them. I also want to talk about index fossils. Usually organisms die in different layers of rock, and these layers can match up, and we can tell how old the fossil is based on how old the rock layer is. So these ammonite fossils can help us tell how old layers of rock are. And so again, these two organisms will line up, and the rock layers help us index things. Here's some famous fossils: trilobites and ammonites, which we've talked about before. They both used to live in the sea or in a marine environment. Let's look at the video clip on fossils.
You found a fossil? Hey, why are you digging a hole in the backyard? I don't think that's a fossil. I think it belongs to the Rottweiler next door. Dear Tim and Moby, what makes something a fossil? From Ross. Well, a fossil is a remnant of an organism. Usually, fossils are at least several thousand years old and found in the ground. Not every organism gets fossilized after it dies. As a matter of fact, it's a pretty rare occurrence. Fossilization has to start off with the right circumstances, like a quick burial. This is a body fossil, a part of the original organism that's been preserved. It's a bug that got trapped in amber, a type of sticky tree sap. Over time, the sap hardened, and we were left with this little keepsake. Body fossils are usually found in places where bacteria, insects, and the other things that cause decay aren't able to thrive. They form when an animal dies in the desert, or gets frozen in ice, or, gets trapped in a tar pit. Yeah, well, body fossils are really rare. Trace fossils, like these footprints, are the most common fossil type. Trace fossils can include animal tracks, nests, bite marks, and even animal poop. Other types of fossils form when an animal dies and is immediately covered by earth, mud, or sand. The covering slows decay down to a crawl and eventually turns to solid rock. The hardest parts of the animal, stuff like bones, teeth, and shells, don't decay for thousands of years. When they finally do, they've left a lasting impression in the rock. That's a mold fossil, a hollow print. Sometimes, water will bubble up through the earth, filling a mold with minerals. Over time, the minerals harden into rock, leaving a cast fossil. A cast fossil looks just like the original bone or shell. Right, of course, there are also carbon-based fossil fuels. All of the oil, gas, and coal on Earth was formed from the remains of fossilized plants and animals. For example, way back, like 300 million years ago, much of the planet was covered by tropical swamps. When the trees and plants that lived there died, they drifted to the bottom of the swamp. There, they slowly decomposed and formed a soggy, spongy substance called peat. Eventually, the peat got buried under layers of dirt and rock. Heat and pressure took their toll, and after millions of years, the peat turned into coal. Anyway, we can learn a lot from fossils. By looking closely at the fossil record, we can discover when and where lots of different organisms lived. In fact, we can learn about the entire history of life on Earth. Oh, the fossil record is just a fancy term for the sum total of what we know about fossils. Yeah, that's not going to work. It has to be under extreme pressure for millions of